Bethany Hawthorne led enforcement like a drill sergeant, and she believed rules would always protect her. Her mistake was trusting a retroactive addendum and a private contractor to finish what she'd started. That misplaced confidence would be exposed in public hearings, and eventually it would help produce indictments that unmade her tiny kingdom. If you watch part 1, you remember the sound of bolt cutters and the morning a flatbed rolled through our gate. This part is where the story stops being about a single toe and begins to look like a plan. Hidden pages, a buried clause, and a contract with a developer change the stakes from petty enforcement to deliberate displacement. Where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments. After the Jeep left on the flatbed, Willowbrook felt as if it had been trimmed and resealed. The street returned to its measured pace, but the hum under daily life had a new note, a frequency of unease. People who had applauded under the impression of order suddenly found their applause hollow. The politeness that had once smoothed over disputes began to crack. The first momentum beat of this rising action was small but telling. Anonymous notes started appearing on windshields and under doormats. "Good work on enforcement," one read, unsigned. Another said, "Keep our neighborhood clean." The second momentum beat hit when a security guard from the private firm Bethany favored approached my sister at the grocery store. He asked casual questions about my work and whether the Jeep in question had been used late at night. The conversation had the shape of a fishing expedition. People in uniforms who ask casual questions often have designs more serious than curiosity. Neighbors reacted in two camps. Some felt safer. Disorder had been removed, and the new status quo was neat. Others grew suspicious. Mrs. Patterson stopped sleeping well. She walked her dog at dawn, and she stared through her blinds whenever anyone in a vest moved down the street. Her small acts of watchfulness made her a kind of sentinel for the uneasy. Spent nights awake reading my paperwork and making copies. Bureaucratic defense felt prosaic compared to the emotional torque of seeing a trusted household item hauled away, but it was the tool we had. I cataloged registration numbers, emails, and the citation notices the board had sent. I printed photographs taken by my sister and neighbors. I had to make the intangible visible. A perceived loss deepened the tension. Word filtered through that the tow company had stored the Jeep at an off-site yard under a tarp. Parking it in an unguarded lot increased the chance of damage or tampering. The agency contact, when I reached her on the second call, sounded stunned and said she was coordinating with legal counsel. "This is not how property with agency ties is handled," she said, careful and blunt. "We will escalate." Escalation is a formal word. It implies law, notice, and people with badges. Rumors colonized the neighborhood's mental landscape. The task force sticker that one neighbor had glimpsed on the Jeep's window took on life. Stories spread about sensitive equipment, federal property, and possible national security implications. Nobody in the cul-de-sac had a clear picture, but half-certainty often travels faster than knowledge. Bethany, meanwhile, moved with the assuredness of someone who believes the law is a dress that fits her perfectly. She published a short bulletin to residents asserting the board's authority and praising the enforcement action as necessary for community standards. Her language was measured, the kind that discourages argument by tone. She thanked residents for trusting the board. Momentum beat 3. The agency filed a formal notice through an on-call attorney, and within hours an investigator called my sister, asking to meet and review footage. The investigator's voice was direct. He wanted to see recordings and chain of custody details. The mere presence of an investigator changed things from neighborhood spectacle to official concern. The investigator's visit revealed a small but important contradiction. The tow company's paperwork said the property owner authorized the removal, but the HOA minutes from 2 years prior showed a clause that, if properly interpreted, exempted certain government or task force equipment from ordinary towing procedures. The minutes were obscure and buried in a binder that few residents ever read. Obscure minutes are like old roots. They can change who you thought enjoyed the sunlight. Neighbors began to pick sides. A formerly quiet block erupted into a territory of alliances. A barbecue turned tense when someone asked my sister if she considered moving. A man who'd once argued for civic enforcement whispered that I'd been difficult. Social capital, the currency of neighborhoods, shifted quickly. People measure belonging by how closely they follow a leader's sense of propriety. Perceived loss turned into active pressure. A petition appeared on the HOA portal to retroactively ratify the emergency addendum that had tightened rules. The petition had a professional polish, scanned signatures, legal-sounding phrasing, and a timeline that implied urgency. One of the signatories was the city councilman's assistant. By now, the county's unspoken dynamics were engaged. Developers. Watch these things. A quieter menace surfaced in whispers about property values, resale, and the family-friendly brand Willowbrook wanted to sell. Bethany had allies beyond our street who preferred tidy lots and buyers without complications. The Jeep, it appeared, was an obstacle in a larger marketing plan. A near win arrived when federal investigators pinged the tow yard and, after some back and forth, indicated they would not allow the Jeep to be moved pending review. The flatbed company balked, a moving government-marked property without clear authorization. That legal pause felt like a breath held at the top of a cliff. Tension and relief in a single inhale. Then the betrayal. One neighbor I thought sympathetic sent an email to the board claiming they had seen the Jeep used in ways that violated the association standards. The email referenced late-night activity and unmarked operations in tone that implied danger. It struck me as a small, sharp stab from someone I had offered neighborly smiles to in the past. The community responded to fear the way it often does, with a mixture of appeasement and escalation. People who feared association with controversy signed the ratification petition. Those who stayed quiet feared being targeted next. The neighborhood's willingness to stand with dignity was dissolving under bureaucratic strain. In the background, a quieter legal drama brewed. Federal agents began to ask for access to security footage from homes close to the flatbed route. The footage would reveal sequence, timing, and faces. Mine contained a time-stamped recording of the bolt cutters and the unlock, the moment that had sent the GPS ping out across networks. The footage would be important. A small sound broke the night's growing tension. 2 knocks at my door. They were polite, professional knocks. When I opened, a plainclothes investigator asked to see my documentation and to record a statement. He spoke not with accusation, but with the gravity of someone preparing a file. He asked about chain of custody and whether any sensitive equipment might have been accessed. My throat stayed tight. The questions reframed the morning's actions as more than a neighborhood scuffle. The first real reveal was not dramatic in the way movie stage reveals. It arrived in a file folder with a brittle stapled header and a line that made the spine of my chest buzz. Buried in HOA archival minutes from 30 years ago was a clause that explicitly exempted equipment used by official agencies or municipal task forces from ordinary covenant enforcement. The discovery felt like finding a map to a buried boundary you had been told did not exist. My sister uncovered it while searching for precedent. She read aloud the clause, language dense with legal sense but clear in its intent. The document had the dated stamp of a town clerk and the faint signature of a long-gone board member. Whoever wrote it had anticipated the friction between community standards, civic obligations. Whoever had folded it into the binder assumed no one would look. The reveal altered the frame. The Jeep had not been a casual target. It might have been legally protected, yet Bethany had acted as if the addendum didn't exist. She disregarded archived law. That discrepancy suggested purposeful omission rather than accident. A small reversal occurred in neighbors' minds. Those who had cheered enforcement now felt the unsettling taste of being used while law bent the other way. There was an emotional beat that followed, the moment when indignation met the bitter suspicion of intention. Someone had either failed to read or deliberately ignored the clause. That possibility carries a different moral weight. Neglect is forgivable in theory. Malice is corrosive. I shared scans of the minutes with a small group of residents who had grown skeptical. The group grew like an organism assembling itself around shared bewilderment. Mrs. Patterson, the retired librarian, organized copies. A young couple who had been sellers last year offered to help with digital archiving. We began to build a public record of what the HOA had actually voted on decades before Bethany's presidency. But the reveal produced a setback. The board's posted emergency addendum included a retroactive validation clause, which Bethany argued, in a new bulletin, allowed the recent action to stand. The bulletin had a polished tone and cited a majority vote at a hastily called meeting. It wasn't convincing to those who had read the archived minutes, but it was persuasive to the many who trusted the board's public statements. The difference between historical record and the present narrative is where power tends to concentrate. The next emotional turnover was a reversal of trust. That one neighbor who had once supported me, the one who sent an incriminating email, revealed in a private conversation that he had been pressured by an unnamed city official. Pressure can be quiet, a reference withheld, an implied risk to one's business license, a vague suggestion that association with controversy would harm future prospects. Fear is a persuasive currency. Perceived loss deepened when Bethany used the retroactive clause to insist that her enforcement actions were legal and that any objection should be handled through the board's dispute process. The board's dispute process was slow, bureaucratic, and inside out. It required residents to appear at meetings that the majority infrequently attended. The process felt designed to absorb resistance until it faded. A second momentum beat came from an unexpected direction. A journalist from a local paper, following a tip, contacted my sister. Unlike the neighbors, the journalist asked strident questions and wanted documents. They wanted to know if this was a case of overreach or something darker. The attention was a kind of sunlight, illuminating and uncomfortable. When the paper ran a piece, it turned the matter from private grievance into public question. With the local press, the disagreement widened. People who had once felt safe aligning with Bethany began to weigh whether their names attached to enforcement might affect their reputations. The small political calculus of the cul-de-sac started to wobble. While the pressure mounted on Bethany, the agency filing for the Jeep escalated to a legal notice demanding immediate return of government property and asserting federal custody. The notice invoked procedures that the HOA had no authority to override. For the first time, the neighborhood faced people in suits whose authority did not depend on elections or social capital. The document in my hand was a contract between the HOA and a development consultancy. It was dated 6 months before Bethany's presidency and outlined a neighborhood optimization plan. The dense corporate language promised an increase in property values, a refined community profile, and a timeline for selective enforcement intended to encourage targeted sales. It read like a developer's checklist disguised as civic improvement. Reading that contract was the midpoint twist. What had presented itself as petty rule enforcement now revealed a coordinated strategy to alter the composition of the neighborhood. The Jeep was not simply an eyesore. It was an obstacle to marketing Willowbrook the way the contract imagined. Polished, predictable, and free of perceived complications. The twist reframed everything. Bethany's enforcement began to look less like spontaneous civic righteousness and more like strategic curation designed to produce a payoff. The payoff in the contract was explicit. The consultancy proposed a partnership with a developer interested in acquiring select parcels to build townhomes aimed at a higher market segment. One line mentioned reducing non-conforming uses near key lots identified in an appendix. That appendix was a list of addresses, oddly precise and missing a few home numbers. My grandmother's house, a modest parcel that had been in the HOA family for decades, rested circled in the margin. The revelation felt personal and predatory at once. Predation hides in plain sight when wrapped in professional language. Momentum beat one of the midpoint. As evidence of the contract circulated, Bethany convened an emergency meeting and framed the discussion around fiscal responsibility. She claimed the contract was exploratory and mischaracterized by opponents. Her tone was measured. Her words were designed to reassure while obscuring. Language can comfort and deflect at once. An unexpected setback came from the city councilman, who had been a Bethany ally. He publicly stated he had no knowledge of the contract, a careful disavowing statement, but one of his aides, who'd quietly benefited from development campaign donations, resigned days later under undisclosed circumstances. Politics is often a constellation of pressure and retreat. Perceived loss swelled when I began receiving thinly veiled threats. Not overt violence, but notes placed on my car. Not everyone gets to stay. Think about resale. The message arrived at dusk and smelled faintly of cold tobacco. Threats that imply economic and social exile shape choices more surely than direct intimidation. The neighborhood's social currency had shifted. Inclusion now depended on alignment with a plan some people had never consented to. A near win occurred. When a coalition of residents who opposed the contract, teachers, retirees, long-term owners, filed a request for a judicial review of the HOA's authority to enact retroactive bylaws. The filing bought time and forced the issue into a public legal process. Time in legal matters can be the difference between an outcome and its reversal, but the development consultancy escalated in a way that made the stakes national. A leaked email from the consultancy to its client mentioned the presence of a task force vehicle and recommended that sensitive assets be carefully handled to avoid publicity. The email suggested paying a small compliance contractor to manage removals quietly. This revelation indicated coordination between private firms and community governance. It suggested a layered plan, used the board's authority to clear obstacles, then leverage sales to profit. In other words, the neighborhood standards were a mechanism for displacement. We found a contract, a list of target parcels circled in pen. And suddenly the towing looked less like law and more like a plan. In the next video, you'll see how that plan reached into bank accounts, security patrols, and a developer's timeline. Would you have dug into old HOA minutes if you suspected wrongdoing, or would you leave it to the authorities? Tell me what you do and why.